The crystal chandelier in the grand foyer of my parents' Beacon Hill estate cast cold, shimmering light over 80 people dressed in black. It was the evening after my father's funeral, and the heavy smell of white lilies hung in the warm air. I stood near the mahogany staircase, wearing a simple navy dress, holding a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. My hands were stiff. For 12 years, I had served as a senior forensic financial auditor for one of the top risk assessment firms in Boston. I spent my life hunting down missing funds, unraveling shell companies, and finding truths that powerful people tried to bury. But standing in that hallway, I felt like a frightened 8-year-old girl again, desperately hoping my mother would finally look at me with something resembling pride. My father, Arthur Vance, had been a quiet, brilliant investor who built Vance Capital from a 2-room office into a respected private equity firm. But for the last 3 years of his life, as his health faded, my younger brother Julian and my mother Victoria had quietly pushed me out of the family inner circle. And every single time they pushed, I had stepped back, quietly accepting it, because I thought that being patient and dutiful was how you proved your love to a family. Julian stood near the marble fireplace, holding a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He was 34, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, speaking with calculated confidence to 2 senior partners from the firm. Julian wasn't a fool. He had a sharp mind, an Ivy League degree, and an extraordinary ability to convince roomfuls of investors to follow his lead. But he was also a man consumed by pride. He believed he was destined for greatness and that rules were meant for ordinary people. My mother, Victoria, stood beside him, watching him with an expression that bordered on worship. Victoria had spent 40 years married to my father, a man who managed every single penny of the family wealth with an iron fist, leaving her feeling helpless and dependent. In Julian, Victoria saw her chance to finally rule. She believed that by putting her charismatic son on the throne, she was securing the respect and power she had been denied her entire life. Victoria tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute, catching the attention of the room. The conversations faded. "Thank you all for coming tonight to honor Arthur," Victoria said, her voice poised and smooth. "My late husband was a man of tradition. He believed in legacy. And tonight, in accordance with his final wishes, we are formally announcing the future of Vance Capital." She signaled to a man sitting in a leather armchair nearby, Arthur's personal estate attorney, Richard Sterling. Richard opened a leather folio and pulled out a document stamped with a red notary seal. "Under the terms of the updated estate decree executed 6 months ago," Richard announced, reading from the paper, "the controlling 70% equity stake in Vance Capital, along with the Beacon Hill estate and all liquid investment accounts, is bequeathed entirely to Julian Vance." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Julian smiled, bowing his head in modest gratitude, though his eyes sparkled with victory. I stood completely still. Every habit of my life told me to keep my head down, to shrink, to avoid a scene. But as I looked at my father's portrait above the fireplace, something inside me finally snapped. I stepped forward. "6 months ago?" I said, my voice cutting quietly through the applause. The room went silent. Victoria's smile tightened as she turned toward me. "Is there a problem, Nora?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "My father suffered a severe stroke 7 months ago," I said, my heart beating fast against my ribs. "He was under medical sedation at the Boston Neurological Institute 6 months ago. He couldn't sign a credit card receipt, let alone a complex estate decree transferring a $70 million firm." Julian took a slow, calculated step forward, setting his scotch glass on the mantelpiece. He didn't look flustered. He looked like a CEO handling a minor PR issue. "Nora, please," Julian said softly, his voice full of brotherly concern. "Don't let your grief make you say things you'll regret. Dad knew that Vance Capital required aggressive public leadership. You have your own career in forensic accounting. You're a back-office analyst. You don't know how to navigate high-stakes venture markets." "I managed Dad's personal audit ledgers for a decade, Julian," I replied, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts. "I know every asset, every account, and every debt structure in that firm. Victoria let out a soft, cold laugh. Oh, Nora, always counting pennies while your brother sees the grand picture. Your father recognized that a daughter who spends her life digging through dusty paper trails isn't built to lead an empire. Julian is his father's son. Victoria gestured toward 3 large, weathered wooden crates sitting near the closet door in the hallway. Your father did leave something specifically for you, Nora, Victoria continued, a small smirk touching her lips. His archival research boxes, 30 years of his personal notes, old tax filings, and historical ledgers. Since you love paper trails so much, you can take his old trash and leave the actual business to your brother. Several guests chuckled quietly. Julian looked at me with an expression of quiet triumph. We need you to clear out your childhood bedroom by tomorrow evening, Nora, Julian added smoothly. Brienne and I are remodeling the guest wing. Brienne, Julian's fiancée, a sharp, ambitious marketing director who had joined the firm 4 months earlier, smiled tightly from his side. I looked at my mother, then at my brother, and finally at the 3 wooden crates sitting in the hallway. My stomach churned with a nauseating mix of humiliation and grief. For a terrifying second, a voice inside my head whispered that maybe they were right. Maybe I really was just an awkward analyst who didn't belong in their shining world. I swallowed the lump in my throat, walked over to the closet, and picked up the first heavy wooden crate. I'll take his archive, I said, looking Julian straight in the eye. Every single page. I spent the next 48 hours in a small, rented 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge. The rooms were cold, filled with the smell of old paper and printing ink. I stacked the 3 wooden crates in the center of the living room floor, pulled up a folding chair, and opened my father's original archival boxes. To anyone else, these crates looked like useless clutter. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that my father never kept a piece of paper without a reason. The mystery didn't reveal itself all at once. It unraveled in slow, terrifying stages. On the first night, after going through hundreds of yellowed tax filings, I found a series of confidential bank transfers from 3 years ago. My breath hitched. Julian had convinced my father to back a series of high-risk offshore real estate developments in South America. The developments had failed miserably, but instead of letting Julian go bankrupt, my father had restructured the loss. He had taken out $32 million in high-interest corporate debt notes through an offshore entity, placing the debt directly onto Vance Capital's liability sheet. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. This was the first piece of the puzzle. By forging that estate decree 6 months ago and seizing absolute ownership of Vance Capital without an independent risk audit, Julian had unknowingly assumed legal management of $32 million in maturing corporate debt. Julian thought he had inherited an empire. In reality, his pride had led him to claim a $32 million financial bomb. My hands shook as I realized what this meant, but my relief was short-lived. The next afternoon, Julian struck back. I arrived at my office in downtown Boston to find my building access badge revoked. When I tried to log into my personal banking app, a red notification flashed on the screen. Account frozen pending legal review. Julian had used Vance Capital's corporate attorneys to file an emergency injunction against me, claiming I had stolen proprietary firm documents from the Beacon Hill estate. He had frozen my credit lines and locked me out of my own professional accounts. I sat in my car in the rain, hyperventilating, pressing my palms against my face. Panic washed over me. Julian was smart. He wasn't just sitting back. He was actively trying to crush me before I could find my footing. I was running out of money. I couldn't pay my rent, and the old fear of being rejected by my family threatened to drown me. For 3 hours, I sat in that dark car, listening to the rain, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I missed my father so deeply it felt like a physical ache in my chest. Think, Nora, I whispered to myself, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. You spent your whole life trying to earn their love. Stop begging for a seat at their table and build your own. I drove back to my Cambridge apartment, locked the door, and dumped the contents of the 3rd wooden crate onto the floor. I worked through the night, digging deeper into the archive. On the second day of searching, I found a black leather binder labeled The Vance Heritage Trust. My hands trembled as I read the pages. My father had transferred the deed to the $15 million Beacon Hill estate and $40 million in private municipal bonds directly into an irrevocable trust decades ago. The corporate decree that Julian had forged only transferred assets owned directly by Vance Capital. But the house and the municipal bonds didn't belong to the company, they belonged to the trust. I felt a surge of hope. But as I turned to the back of the trust document, my heart sank into my stomach. The primary page, the page designating the sole managing trustee with signature authority, was missing. It had been torn out of the binder. No, 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 I whispered, frantically turning the binder upside down, shaking it, searching through every folder in the box. It wasn't there. Without that single page designating me as the trustee, the trust document was legally useless in court. A judge would rule it incomplete and Julian's corporate decree would stand. I collapsed onto the floor amidst the papers, burying my face in my knees, weeping bitterly. Julian had won. I had spent 2 days analyzing his debts, but I had no proof of my own authority. I was just a bitter daughter sitting on the floor of a rented apartment, completely defeated. I stayed on that floor for hours, exhausted and hopeless. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when my eyes caught sight of an old silver-framed photograph sitting at the bottom of the third crate. It was a picture of my father and me when I was 8 years old, standing on the porch of the Beacon Hill house. I picked up the frame, tears blurring my vision. As I held it, I noticed that the backing of the frame was slightly loose. A small piece of yellowed paper was tucked behind the photograph. My fingers trembled as I pulled the wooden back off the frame. Folded neatly behind our childhood picture was the missing page 32 of the Vance Heritage Trust. Written in my father's bold, unwavering black ink was the trustee designation. Nora Vance is appointed sole managing trustee with exclusive, non-transferable signature authority over all trust assets, real estate deeds, and liquid dispersals. On the back of the page, my father had written a short, handwritten note in pencil. Nora, my brave girl. If you are reading this, I know they tried to push you aside. Forgive me for hiding this here. I knew Julian's pride would make him jump at the gold, while your sharp eyes would look for the truth. Protect yourself. Protect what we built. I pressed the paper to my chest, closing my eyes, tears streaming down my cheeks. My father hadn't dismissed me. He hadn't forgotten me. He had trusted my intelligence to find the truth when the time was right. The next afternoon, 3 hours before Julian's grand gala, I met my attorney, Evelyn, at the Norfolk County Registry of Deeds. A senior probate clerk carefully examined page 32 under a magnifying lens, verifying the original watermark state seal and matching my father's signature against the county registry. "It's completely authentic, Miss Vance," the clerk said, stamping the official filing document. "The property title is legally locked under your exclusive authority as sole trustee." Evelyn smiled, sliding the certified copies into her briefcase. "We have them, Nora. Now let's go end this." Meanwhile, in the public eye, Julian was moving fast. He realized that Vance Capital's $32 million debt note was maturing. Instead of panicking, Julian did what any ambitious executive would do. He planned a high-profile deal to cover the deficit. He organized a grand corporate gala at the Beacon Hill estate to announce the sale of 40% of Vance Capital to a consortium of foreign private equity investors for $35 million. Just enough cash to cover the corporate liabilities and pocket $3 million for himself. On the night of the gala, the Beacon Hill estate was lit up like a palace. Over 100 of Boston's wealthiest investors, politicians, and reporters gathered in the marble ballroom. Julian stood on the raised stage near the fireplace, wearing a tailored tuxedo, holding a microphone, surrounded by his foreign investors. My mother, Victoria, sat in the front row, wearing a diamond necklace, glowing with pride as she watched her son prepare to close the deal of his life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, "tonight marks a historic evolution for Vance Capital. As the sole owner and managing director, I am proud to sign the master equity transfer agreement." The crowd applauded. Brienne stood beside him, holding a silver pen on a velvet tray. Julian took the pen, leaned over the mahogany table and prepared to sign the contract that would sell assets he didn't legally own. I wouldn't sign that paper, Julian. My voice rang out clearly, echoing across the marble ballroom. The room went instantly quiet. Guests turned around in surprise. Victoria's face twisted in disgust as she spotted me near the entrance. Nora? How did you get in here? Security, remove her. Julian set the pen down, maintaining his smooth, professional smile for the cameras. Nora, please stop embarrassing yourself. Security, escort my sister out. I didn't move. I walked slowly down the center aisle, accompanied by my attorney, Evelyn, and two senior agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I'm not here to embarrass you, Julian, I said, stopping at the edge of the stage. I'm here to enforce Dad's real estate decree. Julian scoffed. We have a notarized decree, Nora. I own Vance Capital. I own this house. I own every asset in this room. You own the equity of Vance Capital, Julian, I agreed, pulling a blue folder from my briefcase. Which means you personally accepted management of the $32 million in matured corporate debt notes that Dad placed on the company's liabilities sheet 3 years ago. Julian's smile flickered. What? What are you talking about? One of the IRS agents stepped forward, pulling a federal badge from his coat. Mr. Vance, I am Special Agent Miller with the IRS. As the managing owner of Vance Capital, you failed to respond to formal notices regarding delinquent offshore tax obligations. A preliminary administrative freeze has been placed on Vance Capital's primary operating accounts as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. Whispers erupted through the crowd. The foreign investors on stage immediately backed away from Julian, their faces pale. That's impossible! Victoria shrieked, standing up from her chair. My son inherited an empire. The firm is worth $70 million. The firm is insolvent, Victoria, I said coldly. And because Julian signed the inheritance transfer without an independent risk audit, he is personally liable for those corporate commitments. Julian's face drained of all color, but he rallied quickly. He looked at his corporate attorney, Richard Sterling, standing in the front row. Richard, stop this. Show them the notarized estate decree. She's bluffing. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled a document from his coat. Special Agent, Miss Vance's claims are irrelevant to this property. Julian Vance holds absolute title to the Beacon Hill estate through the updated estate decree. He has full authority to leverage this asset, Julian sneered, stepping to the edge of the stage. Did you hear that, Nora? My attorney just shut you down. The house is mine. I'll sell the house to clear the company accounts. I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I felt no urge to yield, no desire to win my mother's approval, and zero fear of my brother's anger. I opened my blue folder and pulled out the certified deed for the Beacon Hill estate, along with page 32 from the silver photo frame. You don't own this house, Julian, I said, my voice steady, calm, and utterly commanding. And neither does Mom. Victoria stepped toward the stage, her body shaking. This is my home. Arthur left it to us. Dad transferred this estate into the Vance Heritage Trust 20 years ago, I explained, looking straight into my mother's eyes. The decree you forged 6 months ago only transferred assets owned directly by Vance Capital. But this house belongs to the trust. Richard Sterling grabbed the document from my hand, scanning the state registry stamp frantically. His eyes widened in horror. Julian, this is an unamended, irrevocable trust. The corporate decree doesn't touch this title. What? Julian shouted, grabbing Richard's arm. Declare it invalid. Say it's a forgery. It was officially verified and registered at the Norfolk County Registry 3 hours ago, Mr. Vance. Evelyn interjected firmly. Page 32 carries the original state seal. It is legally bulletproof. I looked up at Julian, meeting his terrified gaze. And under the unamended terms of the trust, I continued, I am the sole managing trustee with exclusive signature authority over this property. You are sitting in my house, Julian, on my furniture, under my chandeliers. the ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, camera lights were flashing, and guests were hurrying toward the exit to escape the scandal. Julian dropped the silver pen, collapsing onto a chair behind the mahogany table, staring at me as if I were a ghost. Nora. Victoria gasped, stumbling down the stage steps toward me, her eyes filled with tears of terror. Nora, please. You're his sister. You can't let them freeze his accounts. You can't let him be ruined. I looked at my mother, the woman who had spent her life seeking power through her son, who had handed me 3 wooden crates and told me I was worthless. I didn't do this to him, Victoria, I said softly. You and Julian did this to yourselves. You were so blinded by your own pride, so desperate to push me aside that you didn't even bother to read the papers you were signing. Please, Nora, Julian begged, his voice cracking, looking up from his chair. Fix this. You're a financial auditor. You know how to restructure the debt. Fix it for the family. I looked at my brother, then at my mother, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The old need for their validation had completely burned away, leaving only peace. You wanted my father's legacy, Julian, I said quietly. Now you have it. All $32 million of it. I turned on my heel and walked out of the marble foyer into the cool Boston night, leaving my mother and brother standing in the ruins of their own arrogance. Over the next 6 months, the fallout was absolute. The IRS and private creditors enforced their claims against Vance Capital. To satisfy the corporate liabilities, Julian was forced to liquidate his personal assets, his luxury car, and his private investments. The firm filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, its reputation permanently destroyed. Brienne left Julian within 2 weeks of the gala, moving back to New York after issuing a public statement, claiming she had been financially misled by the Vance family. Victoria was forced to move out of the Beacon Hill estate after the trust formally evicted her. She moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in suburban Quincy, stripped of her high society memberships, her charity board positions, and her social standing. As the sole managing trustee of the Vance Heritage Trust, I took full control of the $40 million in municipal bonds and the Beacon Hill estate. I didn't sell the house. Instead, I converted the grand main floor into the headquarters for the Arthur Vance Foundation for Forensic Financial Ethics, an organization dedicated to helping small investors and families detect corporate fraud. I moved my own auditing firm into the upper floors, hiring brilliant young analysts who had been overlooked by traditional Wall Street firms. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in late May, I sat in my father's old study on the 2nd floor of the estate. The room was warm, filled with the smell of leather-bound books and sunlight. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the small wooden box that I had found at the very bottom of the 3rd archival crate box I hadn't opened until today. Inside was a small gold fountain pen that my father had used throughout his career, and a folded piece of stationery dated 1 week before his stroke. I opened the note and read his final words to me. Nora, if you are reading this, it means the storm has passed. I am sorry I could not shield you from the painful nature of your brother and mother. I saw their pride growing, and I knew that if I tried to fight them openly in my weakened state, they would only cause more damage. I created the archive because I knew only you had the patience, the intellect, and the integrity to understand it. I didn't give you the company because I wanted to protect you from its hidden debts. I gave you the trust because you were always the true foundation of this family. Never shrink yourself to make smaller minds comfortable. Wear your brilliance proudly. With all my love, Dad. I held the note against my chest, a quiet, peaceful tear rolling down my cheek. People often ask me if trapping Julian and my mother gave me the satisfaction I had imagined on the night of my father's funeral. The truth is, watching them lose everything didn't heal the pain of being rejected by my own family. Seeing their disgrace didn't make up for the years I spent feeling invisible. What actually healed me was something much deeper. Standing in that study, reading my father's final letter, and realizing that I had never needed their approval to be worthy. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you, if you have ever been pushed into the shadows while someone else took the credit, remember this. Vanity seeks the spotlight, but truth controls the foundation. Let them have their applause. You just make sure you hold the pen when it's time to sign the ledger.